All right, so have you ever like caught yourself doing something?
Yeah.
And then you're like, wait a minute, why did I just do that?
Yeah.
Like one that always gets me is like I buy something and I'm like, oh, I thought this was going to be like way more useful
Happens all the time.
than it is.
Yeah.
And it ends up just gathering dust. Like, or another one that I think we've all probably done is like sticking with some kind of investment, even though it's pretty clear it's not going the way we hoped.
Oh, yeah. Sunk cost fallacy. That's a classic.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
It just makes you wonder, like, why don't we always act in like this perfectly rational way, like a computer or something?
Right. Like those perfectly rational beings that traditional economics always assumes we are.
Yeah. So that's what we're going to dive into today. And we're going to do it with this summary of Richard Thaler's book, Misbehaving, The Making of Behavioral Economics.
Yeah, this book's kind of like a classic in the fields of behavioral economics. It's a really great way to understand why we humans sometimes will misbehave.
Okay, so for everyone listening, what's our goal here today?
Really what we're trying to do is give you the tools to understand not just why other people make the decisions they do, but also why you yourself make the decisions you do.
Yeah, like why do we do the things that we do?
Yeah.
And then on top of that, it kind of helps us understand how the markets really work, because they don't always work in that perfectly rational way.
Not at all. In fact, one of the core ideas of behavioral economics is that it challenges those traditional assumptions of economics. The ones that say we're all like these perfect rational actors.
Right. So can you give us just like a super basic definition of what behavioral economics is and how it's different?
So basically, behavioral economics takes the ideas from psychology and uses them to explain why people make decisions that might not seem totally rational, from a purely economic standpoint.
So like, sometimes our emotions or just like the way we think about things can lead us to make choices that a perfectly rational person wouldn't make.
Exactly.
Okay, so traditional economics really hangs its hat on this idea that people are always making rational decisions in their best interest.
Right. Yeah, the basic idea is that people will always weigh the costs and the benefits and then choose the option that gives them the most, like happiness or satisfaction, whatever you want to call it.
But behavioral economics is like, hold on a sec. It's not always that simple.
Yeah, exactly. It says, what about all those other things that influence us, like our emotions, our biases, or even just like what other people are doing?
Yeah.
Those things can lead us to make decisions that maybe aren't the best in the long run.
It's so true. So the book talks about this idea of paradigm shifts.
Yes.
Like what Thomas Kuhn was talking about. Like, how does behavioral economics fit into that whole idea?
So Kuhn talked about how like science doesn't always move forward in a straight line. Sometimes there are these huge shifts in thinking and then everything changes. Yeah. Well, behavioral economics is kind of like that. It's a big shift in how we think about economics. Instead of just starting with these theoretical models of how people should act, it's about looking at how they actually act.
It's like looking at the real world instead of just the textbook.
Exactly. It's about using experiments and surveys and real data to understand how people make decisions.
Oh, okay, I get it. So to give an example, the book talks about someone who gets a musical instrument as a gift.
Yes.
But they can't really afford it. So what would traditional economics say that person should do?
So traditional economics would say, this person, they should just sell the instrument. Like logically, it makes sense. They could use the money to pay off debt or put it towards something they need more.
Right. They could be totally rational.
Yeah, but behavioral economics says, hold on. What if this person like really loves music? Even though they can't afford the instrument, maybe they just can't bear to part with it.
Right. Like what if they get attached to it?
Exactly. Or what if it was a gift from someone special? There are all these other factors that could influence their decision.
It's not just about the money.
Right. It's about all those other things that make us human.
Okay. So then there's this argument that even if individuals aren't always rational, the market as a whole will sort of correct for those irrationalities. Like rational actors will step in and things will balance out.
Yeah. That's the idea of the efficient market hypothesis.
Right. But does behavioral economics agree with that?
Well, it's not so simple.
Okay.
The problem is that even the so-called experts, the people who are supposed to be making these rational decisions, they're also prone to biases and emotions.
Yeah, I can see that.
Like the book talks about the stock market crash of 1989.
Oh, yeah. What about that?
Well, there wasn't really any big news or event that could explain why the market crashed so suddenly. It seemed like it was more driven by fear and panic, like people just reacting emotionally.
So it's like even the experts can get caught up in the moment.
Exactly. And that means that the market isn't always as efficient as we might think.
Interesting. So psychology really plays a big role in all of this.
Yeah.
So how has this shift towards studying how people actually behave changed the way we do economics?
It's had a huge impact. Like, one of the biggest changes is that economists are doing a lot more experiments and surveys. They're actually going out and observing how people behave in different situations.
Yeah, the book mentions this study about snow shovel pricing.
Right.
Like after a big snowstorm. What's the story there?
So traditional economics would say that after a snowstorm, when demand for snow shovels is high, stores should raise their prices.
Yeah, supply and demand.
Exactly. But what they found was that people thought that was totally unfair. Like, they were really angry when stores tried to jack up prices.
Yeah, I can see why people would be upset about that.
Right. So it shows that people's sense of fairness can actually be more important than just the price.
So it's not always about the pure economics.
No, sometimes it's about how people perceive things.
Okay, so surveys are another tool that economists use.
Mm-hmm.
But what are some of the things we have to be careful about when we're using surveys?
Well, surveys can be really useful for understanding people's preferences and their beliefs, but you have to be careful about how you design them. The way you word the questions, or even just the order you ask them in, can influence the answers you get.
It's like you have to make sure you're not leading people to a certain answer.
Right. And you also have to remember that people don't always tell the truth on surveys. They might try to make themselves look good, or they might not even be aware of their own biases.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, so another big concept in behavioral economics is this idea of imperfect self-control. Can you explain that one?
Sure. So we all have these long-term goals, like eating healthy or saving money. But then we also have these short-term desires that can get in the way.
Right, like eating a whole bag of chips when you're trying to lose weight.
Exactly. And sometimes those short-term desires win out. It's like there's this battle going on inside our heads between the planner who wants to make good decisions and the doer who just wants to do what feels good in the moment.
Yeah, I definitely feel that.
So behavioral economics recognizes that our self-control isn't perfect, and that can have a big impact on our decisions.
Okay, let's talk about some of the specific biases that behavioral economics has uncovered. One that really jumped out at me was loss aversion. What is that all about?
Loss aversion is the idea that we feel the pain of a loss more strongly than we feel the pleasure of a gain.
Like if you lose $10, it feels worse than if you find $10.
Exactly. And that can have a big impact on our decisions.
Oh, how so?
Well, for example, it can make us reluctant to sell investments that are losing money, even if it makes sense to sell them and invest in something else.
It's like we're holding on, hoping it will turn around.
Right. Or we might be unwilling to try something new because we're afraid of failing.
Oh, I see. So loss aversion can make us more risk averse.
Exactly.
Okay, so what about businesses? How does loss aversion affect them?
Well, it can make businesses really cautious about taking risks. They might be afraid to invest in new products or ideas because they're worried about losing money.
It's like they're playing it safe.
Right. But that can also mean that they miss out on opportunities.
Yeah, they can miss out on something big.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So it's important for businesses to understand loss aversion and how it can influence their decisions.
Interesting. Okay, so another concept the book talks about is mental accounting.
Right.
What's that all about?
So mental accounting is the idea that we tend to treat money differently depending on where it comes from or what we plan to use it for.
Oh, like if you get a bonus at work, you might be more likely to splurge on something you wouldn't normally buy.
Exactly. Or if you're saving up for a vacation, you might be less likely to dip into that savings account for something else.
It's like we have different mental buckets for different types of money.
Right. And that can sometimes lead to irrational decisions.
Yeah, I can definitely see that. So all this talk about biases really makes you think about how they can be used to influence people's behavior. And that brings us to the idea of nudging.
Yeah.
What is nudging and how does it work?
So nudging is basically about using these insights from behavioral economics to design policies or environments that encourage people to make better choices.
Like without forcing them to do anything.
Exactly. It's about making it easier for people to do the right thing.
So can you give us an example?
Sure. Like one example is automatically enrolling people in retirement savings plans.
Oh, yeah, that's a good one.
Because people are more likely to stick with the default option, rather than having to actively opt in.
It's like making the healthy choice the easy choice.
Exactly. Or another example is putting healthy food at eye level in a cafeteria.
Oh, that's clever.
Because people are more likely to choose what they see first.
So nudging is all about making those little changes that can have a big impact.
Right. It's about working with human nature instead of against it.
Okay, so let's come back to this idea that traditional economics assumes people are perfectly rational. What does behavioral economics have to say about that?
Well, behavioral economics says that that assumption is just not realistic. People are not perfectly rational. We're influenced by our emotions, our biases, and all sorts of other things.
We're human.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to study how people actually behave in the real world.
Right, not just how they should behave.
Exactly. And that's where things like experiments and surveys come in.
The book mentions Robert Shiller's research.
Yes.
How does that challenge the efficient market hypothesis?
So the efficient market hypothesis says that stock prices always reflect all available information. But Shiller's research showed that stock prices can actually be a lot more volatile than that theory would predict.
So like the market isn't always as rational as we might think.
Right. It's influenced by things like investor psychology and herd behavior.
People following the crowd.
Exactly. So it's not always about perfect rationality.
Okay, so what does all this mean for us as investors?
Well, I think the biggest takeaway is that we need to be aware of our own biases.
Yeah, like we can't just assume we're making rational decisions.
Right. We need to be aware of things like loss aversion and mental accounting. And we need to have strategies in place to help us overcome those biases.
So like what kind of strategies?
Well, one strategy is to invest in mutual funds that have clear investment mandates. That way you're not as tempted to make emotional decisions.
It's like taking the emotion out of it.
Exactly. Or another strategy is to use a systematic investment plan where you invest a fixed amount of money at regular intervals.
That's like automating your investments.
Right. And that can help you avoid making impulsive decisions.
Okay, so to wrap things up, what are the key takeaways from our deep dive into behavioral economics?
I think the biggest takeaway is that we're not always as rational as we think we are.
We're human.
Exactly. Our emotions and biases can have a big impact on our decisions. And that's true whether we're talking about investing or any other area of our lives.
So it's all about understanding those biases and then finding ways to work with them.
Right, to make better decisions for ourselves.
Okay, so here's something for everyone to think about. Think back to a recent financial decision you made. Maybe it was a big decision like buying a house, or maybe it was something smaller like buying a new gadget. Now ask yourself, how much of that decision was based on pure logic, and how much of it was influenced by your emotions or your biases?
Interesting.
And if you had understood those biases better, do you think you might have made a different decision?
Yeah, that's a great question to ask yourself.
It really makes you think, doesn't it?
It does.
So that's it for our deep dive into misbehaving. We hope you enjoyed it, and we hope it gave you some new insights into why we humans sometimes, misbehave.
I think we all misbehave from time to time.
We definitely do.